TV host insults black guest's intelligence, regrets it seconds later. The red on-air sign flickered to life as the familiar jingle of "Good Morning Atlanta" filled Studio A. Derek Lane adjusted his royal blue tie, flashed his trademark smirk at camera 2, and prepared to deliver another morning of what he called real talk with real charm. At 42, Derek had built his reputation on being the host who wasn't afraid to ask the uncomfortable questions, a quality that had earned him both devoted fans and vocal critics. And we're back with Good Morning Atlanta. I'm your host Derek Lane, and boy, do we have a treat for you today, Derek announced, his voice carrying that practiced television smoothness that made everything sound slightly more important than it actually was. We're continuing our month-long series on small business success stories. You know, those inspiring tales of folks who turn their side hustles into something real. The studio audience, a mix of tourists and locals who'd won tickets online, applauded politely. Derek's co-host, Sarah Mitchell, a blonde woman in her 30s who'd learned to navigate Derek's ego with careful smiles and strategic silences, nodded encouragingly from her position at the curved desk. Today, we're joined by Marcus Reed, a local shop owner from Atlanta's inner city who's apparently making quite the name for himself. Derek continued, emphasizing the words "inner city," with just enough inflection to make it sound both exotic and slightly condescending. "Marcus, come on out!" From behind the blue curtain that separated the guest entrance from the main studio, Marcus Reed emerged. He was a tall, lean black man in his late 30s, dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. His white shirt was crisp, his burgundy tie knotted with mathematical precision, and his black leather shoes gleamed under the studio lights. Everything about his appearance spoke of quiet confidence and understated elegance. But Derek, already locked into his preconceived narrative, saw only what he expected to see: another, inspiring, story of someone who'd managed to pull themselves up from humble beginnings. The kind of story that played well with his audience and made him look magnanimous for giving such people a platform. "Marcus Reed, everybody!" Derek announced as Marcus walked across the stage with measured steps, his posture straight, his expression calm and pleasant. "Marcus, welcome to Good Morning Atlanta. Tell us, how does it feel to be here in our big fancy studio?" Marcus settled into the guest chair with fluid grace, his hands folded comfortably in his lap. "It's a pleasure to be here, Derek. Thank you for having me." "Oh, the pleasure's all ours, believe me," Derek replied, his smile a little too wide. "Now I understand you're what we might call a success story from the community. Tell our viewers, what kind of shop are we talking about here? Are we talking about a corner store situation, or maybe some kind of urban fashion thing?" The audience chuckled nervously. Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Marcus, however, simply smiled, a genuine, warm expression that didn't waver despite Derek's loaded language. "I'm involved in retail, among other things," Marcus replied smoothly, his voice carrying a slight southern accent that spoke of Atlanta roots. "We focus on providing quality products and services to our community." Derek leaned back in his chair, his body language screaming casual superiority. "Quality products and services. I love it. Very diplomatic. But let's get real here, Marcus. We're talking about the hustle, right? The side hustle that became something more? I mean, that's what this is all about, taking that entrepreneurial spirit and running with it." "In a way, yes," Marcus agreed, his tone remaining even. "Though I wouldn't necessarily call it a side hustle." "Oh, come on now," Derek laughed, the sound carrying a hint of mockery. "We're all friends here. No judgment. I mean, we all know about the hustle culture these days. Everyone's got something going on the side. Maybe it started in your garage? Or wait, let me guess, drop shipping? That's the big thing now, right? Buy cheap, sell high, work from your laptop?" The cameras caught Marcus's slight pause, the way his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around each other. But his smile never faltered. "It's a bit more complex than that," Marcus said quietly. "Complex?" Derek practically shouted, turning to the audience. See, that's what I love about entrepreneurs. Always making things sound more complicated than they are. But that's smart, right? That's good business sense. Derek turned back to Marcus, his expression taking on what he probably thought was an encouraging, mentoring quality. Look, Marcus, I get it. You've got to talk up your business. But between you and me, and our million viewers, we're talking about street smarts here, right? The kind of real-world education you can't get in some fancy MBA program? The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah actually winced. The audience seemed to collectively hold its breath. Marcus, however, remained completely composed, his dark eyes fixed on Derek with an intensity that might have warned a more perceptive man to change course. There's wisdom in all kinds of experience, Marcus replied, his voice so level it was almost musical. I've been fortunate to learn from many different sources. Derek, mistaking Marcus's restraint for compliance, pressed on. Exactly. And that's what's so great about America, right? You don't need some fancy degree to make it. You just need that hustle, that drive. I bet you've got stories about working twice as hard as everyone else, right? Having to prove yourself? Everyone has to prove themselves, Marcus said simply. Sure, but let's be honest here, Derek continued, his voice taking on a conspiratorial tone. These days, with all the programs and initiatives, there's a lot of help out there for folks starting small businesses. Affirmative action, minority business grants, that whole thing. I mean, it's great that the playing field is being leveled, you know? Gives the little guy a chance. The temperature in the studio seemed to drop 10 degrees. Marcus's smile finally shifted, becoming something sharper, more calculating. His eyes never left Derek's face. The playing field, Marcus repeated slowly, as if testing the words. That's an interesting way to put it. Derek, oblivious to the danger, barreled ahead. Oh, absolutely. I mean, look at you, from the inner city to sitting here on television. That's the American dream right there. And I bet you've got big plans too, right? Maybe thinking about franchising? Taking this thing to the next level? The next level, Marcus echoed, his voice carrying an undertone that should have been a warning. Yes, you could say that. I love it. The ambition. The drive. Derek turned to the audience again. This is what it's all about, folks. Taking those street smarts and turning them into something real. Something legitimate. The word, legitimate, hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly, but his voice remained steady. Legitimacy is important, he agreed. Especially in business. You want to make sure everything is properly structured, properly owned. Derek nodded enthusiastically, completely missing the subtle emphasis on owned. Exactly. Building something that lasts. Something you can be proud of. Something that can support your family, your community. Derek's voice took on the practiced cadence of someone who'd given this speech many times before. And that's what we love to see here on Good Morning Atlanta. People who aren't afraid to dream big, even when they're starting small. Marcus tilted his head slightly, studying Derek with the kind of attention a chess master might give to an opponent who just made a fatal error. Starting small, he repeated thoughtfully. Yes, I suppose everyone starts somewhere. Absolutely. And the beauty of this country is that it doesn't matter where you start, it matters where you finish. The sky's the limit, right, Marcus? The sky's the limit. Marcus agreed, his smile returning, but now it carried something different. Something that might have been anticipation. Derek clapped his hands together, the sound echoing in the studio. Well said. And that's what we're here to celebrate, success stories like yours. People who've taken their piece of the pie and made it into something bigger. Speaking of pie, Marcus said quietly, his words carrying a weight that Derek completely missed. There's always the question of who gets to decide how it's divided. Derek laughed, the sound sharp and dismissive. Oh, that's deep. That's real deep. But hey, that's the beautiful thing about free enterprise, right? There's enough pie for everyone, as long as you're willing to work for it. Marcus nodded slowly, his fingers drumming once against his knee, a small gesture that somehow seemed significant. Work for it, he said. Yes, that's certainly one way to get a piece of the pie. The conversation hung in the air, charged with an undercurrent that Derek was completely oblivious to. In the control room, the producer was already signaling for a commercial break, sensing that something was shifting in the interview's dynamic. Sarah was stealing glances at Marcus, her reporter's instincts telling her that there was more to this story than met the eye. But Derek, secure in his assumptions and convinced of his own cleverness, remained blissfully unaware that he was about to discover just how dangerous it could be to underestimate someone based on the color of their skin and the assumptions that came with it. The foundation had been laid. The trap had been set. And Derek Lane, television host extraordinaire, was about to learn that sometimes the person you're looking down on is actually the one looking down on you. After the commercial break, Derek returned with renewed energy, his confidence seemingly bolstered by what he perceived as Marcus's cooperative demeanor. The audience settled back into their seats, and the cameras rolled once again, capturing Derek's predatory smile as he leaned forward in his chair. Welcome back to Good Morning Atlanta. We're here with Marcus Reed, local entrepreneur and shop owner, Derek announced, his voice carrying that television smooth cadence that made everything sound both important and slightly mocking. Marcus, before the break, we were talking about your business journey. Now I have to ask, and our viewers are probably wondering the same thing, are we talking about a physical storefront here, or is this more of a garage operation? Marcus took a measured sip of water from the glass beside his chair, his movements deliberate and calm. We operate from several locations, he replied simply. Several locations? Derek's eyebrows shot up in exaggerated surprise. Look at you, expanding already. But let's be real here, when you say several locations, are we talking about different corners of the same neighborhood or? He let the question hang in the air, accompanied by a knowing smile that suggested he was being generous by even asking. The audience laughed uncomfortably. Sarah shifted in her seat, her journalism instincts clearly telling her that Derek was walking into dangerous territory. But Marcus remained perfectly composed, his hands folded in his lap, his expression pleasant but unreadable. We have a presence in multiple markets, Marcus said, his voice steady. Geographic diversification is important in any business. Geographic diversification, Derek repeated, turning to the audience with a theatrical expression of amazement. Listen to this guy. Using those big business words. I love it. He turned back to Marcus, his tone becoming more condescending. But let's cut through the corporate speak, shall we? What are we actually selling here? T-shirts? Sneakers? Maybe some of those urban fashion accessories? The pause before urban fashion accessories was loaded with implication. Marcus's smile never wavered, but something flickered in his eyes, a flash of steel that Derek was too obtuse to notice. We deal in various product lines, Marcus replied. Fashion, technology, media content. Media content, Derek interrupted, slapping his knee. So it is online. Dropshipping, right? I knew it. Nothing wrong with that, of course. Very entrepreneurial. Buy cheap from China, mark it up, sell it through Instagram. That's the new American way, right? It's more complex than that, Marcus said, his voice taking on a slight edge that Derek completely missed. Complex, there's that word again. Derek laughed, a sound that was becoming increasingly grating. You know what I love about you, Marcus? You're not afraid to dream big. Even if you're starting small, and hey, we all start somewhere, you're thinking like a real businessman. That's what separates the successful folks from the ones who stay stuck. The implication was clear, and the audience seemed to sense it. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Sarah's jaw tightened. But Derek, drunk on his own perceived cleverness, pressed on. So tell me, Marcus, and this is where it gets interesting, do you plan to make a real company out of this someday? I mean, something with offices, employees, maybe even some of those fancy corporate benefits. Marcus's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around his water glass. Define real company, he said quietly. Oh, you know what I mean, Derek waved his hand dismissively. Something legitimate. Something with proper structure, maybe even shareholders. The kind of thing that could attract serious investment, not just family money or community grants. The silence that followed was deafening. In the control room, the producer was frantically signaling, but Derek was too focused on what he perceived as his masterful interviewing to notice. I think, Marcus said slowly, each word carefully chosen, that legitimacy often depends on perspective. Perspective, sure, Derek agreed, completely missing the warning in Marcus's tone. But let's talk about the real stuff here. The street smarts versus business smarts thing. I mean, you've obviously got the hustle down, that's clear. But running a real business, that takes a different kind of intelligence, doesn't it? The word intelligence hung in the air like a slap. Marcus's smile finally began to fade, replaced by something cooler, more calculating. Different kinds of intelligence, Marcus repeated. Yes, I suppose that's true. Derek, interpreting this as agreement, leaned back in his chair with satisfaction. Exactly. And that's where programs like affirmative action and minority business development come in, right? They help bridge that gap. Give people like you, people with the drive but maybe not the traditional background, a chance to learn the ropes. People like me, Marcus said, his voice so quiet it was almost a whisper. Absolutely. I mean, let's face it, you didn't go to Harvard Business School, right? Derek chuckled at his own joke. But you've got something maybe more valuable, real-world experience. The kind of street education that can't be taught in some ivory tower classroom. Marcus set down his water glass with deliberate precision. Harvard Business School, he said thoughtfully. That's an interesting reference point. Well, I mean, it's just an example. Derek backpedaled slightly, but his condescending tone remained. The point is, you've got natural talent. Raw ability. And with the right support systems, the right guidance, there's no telling how far you could go. Support systems? Marcus echoed. Guidance. Yes, those are important. Derek nodded enthusiastically, completely oblivious to the fact that Marcus was now studying him with the intensity of a scientist examining a particularly fascinating specimen. That's what I love about America. Derek continued, his voice taking on a sermon-like quality. It doesn't matter where you come from. It doesn't matter what your background is. With hard work and maybe a little help from the right programs, anyone can make it. Marcus tilted his head slightly. Anyone can make it, he repeated. That's a beautiful sentiment, Derek. It's not just sentiment, it's fact, Derek proclaimed. And you're living proof of that. From the inner city to sitting here on television, sharing your story with our viewers. That's the American dream in action. The American dream, Marcus said, his voice carrying an undertone that should have been a warning. Yes, I suppose it is. Derek, completely missing the subtle shift in Marcus's demeanor, pressed on with his relentless condescension, digging his grave deeper with every word, completely unaware that he was about to discover just how catastrophically wrong his assumptions had been. Derek glanced at his watch with the practiced efficiency of a television professional, his internal clock telling him it was time to wrap up this segment and move on to the next piece of manufactured entertainment. He had gotten what he wanted from Marcus, a nice, predictable story about determination and humble beginnings that would play well with his audience. Now it was time for the graceful exit. Well, Marcus, Derek said, his voice taking on that familiar television cadence that signaled the end of an interview. This has been absolutely fascinating. Before we let you go, I have to ask, what's next for you? What's the big dream? The next step in your entrepreneurial journey? Marcus paused, his fingers drumming once against his knee in a gesture so subtle it was almost imperceptible. For the first time during the entire interview, he seemed to be considering his words very carefully. The studio lights caught the slight gleam in his dark eyes, and for just a moment, his composed mask slipped to reveal something that might have been anticipation. Well, Derek, Marcus said slowly, his voice carrying a new quality, something that sounded almost like satisfaction. It's interesting that you ask about what's next. Derek nodded encouragingly, already mentally moving on to the next segment. I'm sure our viewers would love to hear about your big plans. Expansion? New product lines? Maybe thinking about going national? Marcus smiled, and this time it was different. This smile held secrets, held power, held the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing something others don't. Actually, we just finalized a rather significant deal last week. Oh? Derek's attention snapped back to the present, his television instincts sensing a potential story. A deal? What kind of deal? An acquisition, Marcus replied, his voice steady but somehow electric with possibility. We acquired a majority stake in a media company. Derek's eyebrows rose with genuine interest for the first time in the interview. A media company? That's quite a leap from retail. What kind of media company? Marcus took another sip of water, the movement deliberate and measured. The studio seemed to hold its breath. Sarah leaned forward slightly, her reporter's instincts suddenly alert. Even the audience appeared to sense that something significant was happening. FDX Media Group, Marcus said quietly, the words dropping into the silence like stones into still water. Derek's smile froze on his face. The practiced television smoothness cracked, revealing something raw and uncertain underneath. FDX Media Group? He repeated, his voice smaller now, less certain. Yes, Marcus confirmed, his own smile widening slightly. We finalized the paperwork on Tuesday. Quite a complex transaction, actually. Lots of moving parts. The studio was dead silent now. Derek's face had gone pale, his confident posture suddenly rigid. Sarah's eyes widened as the implications began to sink in. In the control room, the producer dropped his coffee cup, and it shattered on the floor with a crash that seemed to echo through the building. FDX Media Group, Derek said again, his voice barely above a whisper. That's the parent company that owns this network. Marcus finished helpfully, his tone conversational, almost friendly. Yes, it is. Derek's mouth opened and closed several times, no sound emerging. The cameras caught every moment of his shock, every flicker of dawning horror as the reality of his situation began to penetrate his consciousness. We acquired a majority stake, Marcus continued, his voice calm and professional, as if he were discussing the weather. 53% to be exact. It's been quite a lot of paperwork, as you can imagine. Due diligence, regulatory approvals, staff reviews. The words, staff reviews, hung in the air like a sword. Derek's hands began to tremble slightly. Sarah stared at Marcus with a mixture of shock and something that might have been admiration. It's really quite exciting, Marcus went on, his voice taking on a warmth that hadn't been there before. I'm looking forward to working with all the new teams. Getting to know the various departments. The morning show division, in particular, has caught my attention. Derek's face was now completely white. Sweat beaded on his forehead under the studio lights. The morning show division, he croaked. Oh yes, Marcus nodded, his smile now radiant with genuine pleasure. I've been watching the programming quite closely. Very interesting approaches to content. Very revealing interviewing techniques. The audience began to stir, whispers rippling through the crowd as people started to understand what was happening. Phones appeared as audience members began frantically texting and posting to social media. I have to say, Marcus continued, his tone becoming more conversational, I'm particularly interested in how certain hosts interact with their guests. The kinds of questions they ask. The assumptions they make. It's quite educational. Derek tried to speak, but only managed a strangled sound. His legendary composure, built over years of television experience, crumbled completely. In fact, Marcus said, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a slim leather portfolio. I have some notes here from my meetings with the programming department. Quite detailed feedback on various shows and personalities. He opened the portfolio casually, as if he were simply checking his schedule. Derek's eyes fixed on the papers with the intensity of a man watching his own execution. But enough about business, Marcus said, closing the portfolio and looking directly at Derek with those dark, intelligent eyes. I'm sure our viewers are more interested in hearing about entrepreneurship and the American dream. Isn't that right, Derek? Derek's mouth moved soundlessly. The studio was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning seemed deafening. Marcus's smile was radiant now, warm and genuine and absolutely terrifying in its implications. After all, he said softly, as you said earlier, it doesn't matter where you come from. It doesn't matter what your background is. With hard work and maybe a little help from the right programs, anyone can make it. He paused, letting the words sink in. Anyone can make it, Marcus repeated, his voice carrying a weight that made Derek visibly flinch. Even someone like me. The silence that followed Marcus's revelation lasted exactly 4 seconds. 4 seconds that felt like an eternity in television time. Then, like a dam bursting, the reaction exploded across the studio and beyond. A woman in the third row gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh my God!" she whispered, but in the dead silence of the studio, her words carried like a shout. The man next to her was already pulling out his phone, fingers flying across the screen. "Did he just say what I think he said?" Another audience member muttered, loud enough for the microphones to pick up. Sarah Mitchell, Derek's co-host, was the first to recover her professional composure, though her eyes were wide with shock. "Marcus," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "you're saying that you now own this network?" Marcus turned to her with a smile that was both gracious and slightly amused. "A majority stake, yes. FTX Media Group has been on our acquisition list for some time. The numbers finally aligned." Derek made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob. His face had gone from pale to a sickly green color, and his hands were visibly shaking. This has to be some kind of joke," he managed to croak. "No joke," Marcus replied pleasantly. "Though I have to say, the due diligence process was quite thorough. We reviewed hours of programming, analyzed audience demographics, studied the performance metrics of various shows and hosts." He paused, his eyes meeting Derek's directly. "Very enlightening." In the control room, chaos had erupted. The producer was shouting into his headset, trying to decide whether to cut to commercial or let this catastrophe play out live. Assistant producers were frantically pulling up legal documents, trying to verify what Marcus was saying. The social media monitor was lighting up like a Christmas tree. "Sir, we're getting hundreds of notifications," a young intern called out, her voice cracking with excitement. "Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, this is going viral in real time." And indeed it was. In the age of instant communication, the moment Marcus revealed his identity, the information spread across social media like wildfire. Phones in the audience were capturing every second, live streaming the meltdown to thousands of viewers who were already sharing and resharing the content. At Atlanta Watcher posted, "Holy shit, did the morning show host just insult his own boss on live TV? Hashtag Good Morning Atlanta hashtag epic." At Media Insider tweeted, "Breaking, Marcus Reed, new majority owner of FTX Media Group, just revealed his identity after being patronized by Derek Lane for 20 minutes. This is television history. Hashtag TV Meltdown." At Business Daily added, "The Derek Lane situation is a master class in why you should never make assumptions about people. Marcus Reed just played the long game perfectly. Hashtag respect." Back in the studio, Derek was struggling to regain some semblance of control. "Well," he said, his voice shaky but attempting his old television confidence. "Look at that. I guess we're all in good hands." The forced laugh that followed was painful to hear. The audience wasn't buying it. Sarah wasn't buying it. And Marcus certainly wasn't buying it. "Indeed," Marcus said, his tone polite but carrying an undercurrent of steel. "I take ownership very seriously. Especially when it comes to the culture and values of the organizations I'm responsible for." Derek's forced smile faltered completely. "Culture and values," he repeated weakly. "Absolutely," Marcus nodded. "How we treat people, how we present ourselves to the public, how we use our platform to either build bridges or, well, tear them down. He reached for his water glass again, the movement casual but somehow significant. "These are the things that really matter in media, don't you think?" The audience was no longer pretending to be polite. Murmurs of conversation rippled through the crowd, and several people were openly filming with their phones. The excitement was palpable. They were witnessing something unprecedented, something that would be talked about for years to come. "Derek Lane just got owned by his own boss," someone whispered loudly enough for the microphones to catch. "This is better than reality TV," another voice added. On social media, the reactions were even more explosive. At Comedy Gold, "I can't breathe. This man sat there for 20 minutes being called a garage entrepreneur, and the whole time he owned the network. Loudly crying face, loudly crying face, loudly crying face." At Justice Served, the way Marcus Reed kept his composure while Derek Lane made racist assumption after racist assumption, and then dropped that bomb. Iconic. At TV Critic, "This is the most spectacular self-destruction I've ever witnessed on live television. Derek Lane just ended his own career in real time." The control room cut to a split screen showing live social media feeds, and the numbers were staggering. Hashtag Good Morning Atlanta was trending nationally. Hashtag Derek Lane was trending internationally. Videos of the exchange were being shared thousands of times per minute. Derek, seeing his professional death playing out in real time on the monitors around the studio, made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Marcus, I hope you know that everything I said was just, television. Entertainment. I have nothing but respect for entrepreneurs from all backgrounds." Marcus studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Entertainment," he repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, I suppose it has been quite entertaining." The audience erupted in nervous laughter. Sarah was shaking her head in disbelief. And somewhere in the building, executives were probably having emergency meetings about damage control. But Marcus wasn't done. He calmly sipped his water, set the glass down with precise movements, and smiled at Derek with the kind of patience usually reserved for small children. "You know, Derek," he said, his voice carrying across the silent studio, "I think this conversation has been very educational. For both of us." Derek's last vestige of composure crumbled completely. He slumped in his chair, the weight of his situation finally sinking in. The cameras captured every moment of his defeat, broadcasting it to millions of viewers who were witnessing the spectacular consequences of prejudice and arrogance played out in real time. The moment the show cut to commercial break, Derek's carefully constructed television persona shattered completely. The studio lights dimmed slightly, and the familiar chaos of a commercial break erupted, but this time, it carried an electric tension that no one had ever experienced before. Derek shot up from his chair like a man on fire, his movements jerky and desperate. The makeup artist who approached to touch up his face for the next segment was waved away with such violence that she actually stepped back in alarm. "Where is he?" Derek demanded, his voice cracking. "Where's Morrison? Where's the executive producer? Someone needs to explain to me what the hell is happening here." Sarah remained in her seat, watching Derek's meltdown with a mixture of professional fascination and personal horror. She'd worked with Derek for 3 years, had weathered his ego and his casual cruelties, but she'd never seen him like this, stripped of his confidence, reduced to a panicked, desperate shell of his former self. Meanwhile, Marcus had risen from his guest chair with the same fluid grace he'd displayed throughout the entire ordeal. He was immediately surrounded by crew members, not in a threatening way, but with the kind of respectful attention usually reserved for visiting dignitaries. The makeup artist who Derek had dismissed rushed over to Marcus, offering him water and asking if he needed anything. "Thank you, that's very kind," Marcus said to her, his voice warm and genuine. "You all do excellent work here. Really professional." The young woman beamed at the compliment. Word was already spreading through the crew like wildfire. This wasn't just any guest. This was their new boss. And unlike Derek, he was actually treating them like human beings. Derek, meanwhile, was barreling toward the exit, his face flushed with humiliation and rage. He burst through the doors leading backstage with such force that they slammed against the walls. The narrow hallway that led to the production offices had never seemed so long, and every person he passed, assistant producers, sound technicians, security guards, seemed to be staring at him with a mixture of pity and barely concealed amusement. "Morrison!" Derek shouted as he approached the production offices. "Morrison!" The executive producer, a harried-looking man in his 50s named Bob Morrison, emerged from his office with the expression of someone who'd been expecting this confrontation. His face was pale, and his usually confident demeanor had been replaced by the careful nervousness of a man trying to navigate a career-ending situation. "Derek," Morrison said carefully, "maybe we should." "Don't you Derek me!" Derek exploded, his voice echoing down the hallway. "You set me up! You had to know who that guy was! You had to know!" Morrison glanced around nervously at the gathering crowd of staff members who were pretending to work, while obviously listening to every word. "Derek, let's take this into my office." "No! I want answers now!" Derek's face was now bright red, veins bulging in his forehead. "How long have you known? How long has this acquisition been in the works? Why wasn't I told?" "Derek, please," Morrison pleaded, his own career probably flashing before his eyes. "The acquisition was finalized last week. It wasn't public knowledge. We only found out ourselves when legal called this morning." "This morning?" Derek's voice cracked again. "This morning and nobody thought to tell me? Nobody thought that maybe, just maybe, I should know who I was interviewing?" The truth was devastating in its simplicity. The acquisition had been handled so quietly, so professionally, that most of the network staff had no idea it was happening. Marcus Reed and his team had moved through the corporate world like ghosts, acquiring assets and restructuring ownership without fanfare or publicity. It was a masterclass in business efficiency, and it had left Derek completely exposed. Back in the studio, Marcus was engaging in quiet conversation with various crew members. The camera operators were showing him their equipment, explaining how the live broadcast worked. The sound engineer was walking him through the audio setup. Everyone wanted to make a good impression on the new owner, and Marcus was graciously accepting their attention while asking thoughtful questions about their work. "How long have you been with the network?" he asked the head camera operator, a veteran named Jim who'd been with the station for 15 years. "Since 2010, sir," Jim replied respectfully. "Started as an assistant, worked my way up. That's exactly the kind of dedication we value," Marcus said, and Jim practically glowed with pride. "Experience and loyalty are rare commodities these days." The contrast couldn't have been starker. While Derek was having a meltdown in the hallway, screaming at executives and making enemies, Marcus was quietly building relationships and demonstrating the kind of leadership that inspired loyalty rather than fear. Morrison was trying desperately to calm Derek down, but it was like trying to reason with a hurricane. "Look, Derek, this doesn't have to be a disaster. Maybe we can spin this, maybe we can." "Spin this?" Derek laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Bob, do you have any idea what just happened out there? Do you understand that my career just ended on live television? There's no spinning this. There's no coming back from this." And he was right. In the age of social media and instant replay, there was no hiding from what had just occurred. Derek's condescending, racist assumptions had been captured in high definition and were already being dissected by millions of viewers online. His professional reputation was in free fall, and everyone in the building knew it. Down the hall, in the network's social media monitoring room, a young intern was calling out the numbers in real time. "We're up to 50,000 shares in the last 10 minutes. The video clips are going viral faster than anything we've ever tracked." Derek's humiliation wasn't just local anymore, it was global. And as the reality of his situation continued to sink in, his anger began to transform into something much worse: fear. "My contract," he said suddenly, his voice dropping to a whisper. "When does my contract come up for review?" Morrison's silence was answer enough. Derek's face went from red to white in an instant. "Next month," Morrison finally admitted. Your contract is up for review next month. Derek's legs gave out, and he slumped against the wall, the full weight of his catastrophe finally crushing him completely. 3 hours later, the Atlanta sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the parking lot of the FTX Media Group building. Marcus Reed emerged from the main entrance, his charcoal suit as immaculate as it had been that morning, his posture unchanged by the day's events. He slipped on a pair of sleek black sunglasses and walked with measured steps toward a waiting black sedan. Behind him, the building buzzed with activity unlike anything anyone could remember. Emergency meetings were being called. Contracts were being reviewed. Social media managers were working overtime trying to manage the unprecedented viral storm that had engulfed the network. And somewhere in the building, Derek Lane was clearing out his office under the watchful eyes of security. A small crowd of reporters had gathered outside, having caught wind of the story through social media. They pressed forward as Marcus approached his car, shouting questions over each other. "Mr. Reed, can you comment on Derek Lane's termination? What are your plans for the network moving forward? Did you plan this confrontation, or was it spontaneous?" Marcus paused at his car door, his hand resting on the handle. For a moment, he seemed to consider whether to respond. Then, with the same calm deliberation he'd shown throughout the entire ordeal, he turned to face the cameras. "I believe in treating people with dignity and respect," he said simply, his voice carrying easily across the parking lot. "That applies to everyone, employees, guests, viewers, and members of the community. When those values are compromised, change becomes necessary." "Will there be more changes to the morning show lineup?" a reporter called out. Marcus's smile was slight but genuine. "We'll be conducting a comprehensive review of all programming to ensure it aligns with our values and serves our community in the best possible way." He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. "Excellence comes from bringing out the best in people, not from tearing them down based on assumptions or prejudices." With that, he slid into the sedan and was gone, leaving the reporters to scramble for follow-up stories and the internet to continue its relentless dissection of the day's events. 4 floors up, Derek Lane stood at the window of what used to be his office, watching Marcus's car disappear into traffic. The room behind him was nearly empty now, 20 years of career memorabilia packed into cardboard boxes, his awards and photos relegated to storage until he could figure out what came next. His phone had been buzzing constantly for hours. Some calls were from other networks, curious about his availability but clearly hesitant given the circumstances. Others were from journalists wanting comments. A few were from lawyers, sensing opportunity in his downfall. But most were from friends and family, trying to understand how everything had gone so spectacularly wrong. Derek's reflection in the window showed a man aged beyond his years in the span of a single morning. The confident television personality was gone, replaced by someone who looked lost, smaller somehow. He'd built his career on being the one who asked the hard questions, who wasn't afraid to challenge his guests. But he'd never imagined that his own assumptions and prejudices would become the story. Meanwhile, across town in a community center in East Atlanta, a very different scene was unfolding. Marcus Reed, having changed from his suit into jeans and a simple button-down shirt, was sitting in a circle with a group of young entrepreneurs. The community center was a far cry from the gleaming television studio, fluorescent lights instead of professional equipment, folding chairs instead of designer furniture, but Marcus seemed more at home here than he had anywhere else all day. "The key thing to remember," he was saying to a young black woman who'd been explaining her plans for a catering business, "is that your value isn't determined by other people's ability to recognize it. Your worth exists independent of their acknowledgement." A teenager raised his hand. "But what if they never give you a chance? What if they just see where you're from and write you off?" Marcus leaned forward, his expression serious but encouraging. "Then you create your own chances. You build your own platforms. You acquire your own networks, if that's what it takes." The group laughed, understanding the reference to the day's events that had already become local legend. "But more importantly," Marcus continued, "you remember that their limitations aren't your limitations. Their prejudices aren't your reality. Success isn't just about wealth or power, it's about maintaining your dignity and lifting others as you climb. An older man in the back of the room spoke up. You could have destroyed that man today. On live television, in front of millions of people. But you didn't. Why? Marcus considered the question thoughtfully. Because destruction isn't the goal. Change is the goal. Education is the goal. Building a better world for all of us is the goal. He gestured around the room. That happens here, in communities like this, with people who understand that real success means bringing others with you. As the session ended and participants began to leave, many stopped to thank Marcus personally. They weren't thanking him for the spectacle he'd created that morning, or for the viral moment that had entertained millions. They were thanking him for something much more important, for showing them that dignity could be maintained even in the face of disrespect, that success could be achieved without sacrificing integrity, and that sometimes the most powerful response to prejudice was simply proving it wrong. The story would be told and retold for years to come, the tale of Derek Lane's spectacular downfall and Marcus Reed's masterful restraint. But the real lesson wasn't about revenge or public humiliation. It was about the dangerous cost of assumptions, the power of quiet confidence, and the truth that respect, once lost, is nearly impossible to regain. In the end, Marcus Reed had done more than just embarrass a prejudiced television host. He had demonstrated that true power lies not in tearing others down, but in building something better. And sometimes, the best way to fight ignorance is simply to prove it wrong, with grace, with dignity, and with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly who you are.